There is a hotel in Chicago, 6 stories of brick and stone, more than an acre of floor under one roof, the tallest building in the city in its day. And one winter, men slid it up into the air. Not in a story, not in a drawing. In real life, with guests asleep in the upstairs rooms, with the dining room serving supper, with a United States senator paying his bill at the front desk, the whole building rose 6 feet off the ground while the people inside went about their evening, and most of them never knew. I have been reading the records of how this country was built, and there is a stretch of years in the middle of the 1800s that I keep coming back to. Because we did not have the machines yet, no hydraulic cranes, no diesel engines, no trucks. And yet there are photographs, real photographs, of brick buildings standing in midair, on forests of iron screws, and of whole wooden houses rolling down the middle of a city street behind a single horse walking in a circle. And here is the part that stops me. When that hotel went up, nobody dropped a pane of glass. Nobody cracked a mirror. The plaster did not split. They lifted hundreds of thousands of pounds of masonry by hand, an inch at a time, and they did it so gently that the salt cellars on the dining tables never moved. How? How did they do that without a single machine we would recognize today? Let me start with the problem, because the problem is the whole reason any of this happened. Chicago in the 1850s was built in the wrong place. It sat on flat, wet ground barely above the level of Lake Michigan. The land was so low and so soft that water had nowhere to drain. After a rain, the streets turned to a black soup deep enough to swallow a wagon wheel to the axle. There are accounts of horses going down in the mud, and of joke signs posted in the worst intersections that read, "No bottom here, the fastest way to China." It would be funny if it had not been killing people. Because still water breeds disease. The standing pools in the streets and yards bred sickness year after year. Typhoid, dysentery. And then, in 1854, cholera swept through and killed something close to 1 in every 16 people in the city. 6% of everyone gone in a single season. A growing city, the great young city of the prairie, was drowning in its own ground. The engineers understood the cause. There was no drainage. To carry sewage and rainwater away, you need pipes, and pipes need to run downhill, and there was no downhill. The land was flat as a table. You cannot dig the sewers down into the ground, because the ground is at lake level and the water just sits. There was only one direction left to go. Up. If you cannot lower the water, you raise the city. You lift the whole street grade several feet into the air, you lay your sewer pipes on top of the old ground, you bury them under new fill, and now the pipes have the slope they need. The man who drew up that plan was an engineer named Ellis Chesbrough. In 1856, he proposed raising the grade of central Chicago by as much as several feet, in places more, and building the sewers above the old surface. The Common Council approved it. And that decision created the strangest construction project this country had ever seen, because raising the streets meant the buildings were suddenly too low. Every door, every shop front, every hotel lobby now sat in a pit below the new road. So they raised the buildings too. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Because the men who turned these screws never had their names written down, and I want them remembered. Now, the tools. This is what I want you to hold in your mind. They had no powered lifting equipment of any kind. What they had was the jack screw. A jack screw is a simple thing. It is a heavy iron screw standing in a threaded base, with a long handle or a slot for a bar at the top. You turn the handle, the screw rises, and whatever sits on the screw rises with it. A single man with a bar can lift a load many times his own weight, because the threads multiply his strength. One screw lifts a few tons. The genius was not in the screw. The genius was in using hundreds of them, even thousands of them all at once, all rising together. And that is exactly what they figured out how to do. In January of 1858, they tried it for the first time on a masonry building. The structure stood at the northeast corner of Randolph and Dearborn Streets. 4 stories of brick, 70 feet long, weighing about 750 tons. Men dug in under the walls and set 200 jack screws against the underside of the building. Screws spaced out so the weight was shared across all of them evenly. Then, slowly, They turned. The building rose 6 feet and 2 inches, and the record says it came up without the slightest injury. No cracks, no broken windows. A 4-story brick building, lifted higher than a man can reach, by 200 screws turned by hand. And once it was the talk of the city, the floodgates opened. More than 50 buildings were raised that same year. I want to slow down here, because this is the heart of it. This is how they actually did the impossible part. When you lift a brick building, you cannot lift one corner. If one side comes up faster than the other, even by an inch, the whole wall shears and the masonry comes apart and the building destroys itself. Brick has almost no give. It does not bend. So the entire structure has to rise as one solid piece, perfectly level, every part of it moving the same tiny distance at the same moment. Here is how they managed it. First, they tunneled under the building and put strong timber beams across, under the load-bearing walls, so the weight rested on the wood and not on the soft brick. Then they set the jack screws under those beams, dozens, then hundreds of them, in long ranks down the length of the building. Each screw had a man assigned to it, or sometimes one man worked 2 screws side by side. And then, on a signal, every man turned his screw, the same small amount, at the same time. A quarter turn. A half turn. No more. The foreman gave the call, and the whole line moved together. Turn. The building rises a fraction of an inch. Stop. Check that it is level. Turn. Another fraction. Stop. Check again. Hour after hour, day after day, the building crept up into the air a hair at a time, with crews crawling underneath to slip in fresh blocks of timber and new courses of brick foundation as the gap opened beneath the walls. The men in the trenches worked in near darkness, in mud, under hundreds of tons of building held up by nothing but iron screws and their own steady hands. If a screw failed, if a man turned too far, the weight could shift and crush him. They knew it. And still they kept the rhythm. Turn. Stop. Level. Turn. The discipline of it is what gets me. Hundreds of men, no radios, no machines, just a voice and a shared rhythm, lifting a city block as if it were a single living thing breathing in. It was less like construction and more like a single enormous machine made out of people, and the machine had to keep perfect time or it would tear apart the very thing it was holding up. In 1860, they took on something bigger. A whole row of buildings on Lake Street, between Clark and LaSalle, brick and stone, 4 and 5 stories tall, stretching 320 feet, the footprint covering nearly a full acre. Together, the row weighed something like 35,000 tons. To lift it, they used 6,000 jack screws, worked by 600 men. In 5 days, the entire connected row rose 4 feet and 8 inches, all of it together, all of it level. And here's the detail I love most. The shop stayed open the entire time. Customers walked in off the street, bought their goods, and walked out, while the floor under their feet was slowly climbing toward the sky. People came and went and shopped and worked, just as they ordinarily would, never closing the doors for the men working beneath them. One of the men managing that Lake Street project was a young newcomer to the city, not yet 30, named George Pullman. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. You may know the name Pullman. Later in life, he built the Pullman sleeping car, the luxury railroad coach that carried Americans across the continent in beds and dining rooms, and he built a whole company town outside Chicago to make them. But before any of that, before the rail cars and the fortune and the famous name, George Pullman made his start in the mud, lifting buildings. He had come from New York State, where his father had worked at moving structures out of the path of a canal widening. The young man understood the screw and the patient art of the lift. And in Chicago, he found a city that needed every building raised at once. He understood, before most people did, that if you organized enough hands turning enough screws in perfect time, there was almost nothing too heavy to move. His name is fixed forever to the most famous lift of all. In 1861, a consortium of engineers, including Pullman, took on the Tremont House. The Tremont was a 6-story luxury hotel at the corner of Lake and Dearborn, more than an acre under its roof, the tallest building Chicago had. And they raised it a full 6 feet while it stayed open for business. Think about what that means. The hotel kept its guests. The kitchen kept cooking. The clerks kept the front desk. And underneath, hidden behind awnings and shades and boards so the work would not alarm anyone, hundreds of men, by some accounts around 500, worked something like 1,000 jack screws, lifting the entire hotel inch by inch under covered trenches. Among the guests was a United States senator from Wisconsin. He noticed nothing wrong. The only odd thing any guest reported was that the front steps from the street up to the lobby seemed to grow taller every day. The steps kept being added at the bottom because the lobby kept getting higher off the ground, and the people inside simply climbed a few more stairs each morning and thought nothing of it. That is the level of control they had. They lifted a 6-story hotel 6 feet into the air, over weeks, with people sleeping and eating and doing business inside the whole time, and the worst complaint was a few extra steps. But first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one, unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Now, I have to be honest with you about something, the way I always try to be on this channel. I can tell you about Pullman and Chesbro, the engineers and the contractors, because their names are in the record. The men who actually turn the screws are not. 600 men on Lake Street. 500 under the Tremont. Hundreds more under building after building, year after year, crawling in the wet trenches with hundreds of tons hanging over their heads. We do not have their names. Not one of them. Many were immigrants, men who took the work because they needed the wage. The history books remember the man who later built fancy rail cars, and they forget the man who lay in the mud at midnight, slipping a timber block under a wall so the senator upstairs could finish his dinner in peace. I cannot give you their names because nobody wrote them down. So I will at least give you this. They were here. They did this. And it could not have been done without them. The work went on for years. As late as November of 1865, they raised an iron-fronted building near South Water and Wells, 150 feet long and 80 feet wide, 5 stories, with something on the order of 1,500 jack screws. And the building was only half of the job. Once a structure was up, the new gap underneath and the streets out front had to be filled, packed solid with earth and rubble hauled in by the wagon load, then paved over at the new height. River dredgings, sand, and soil came in by the ton to make the higher ground the buildings now sat on. Block by block, building by building, the central city climbed up out of the swamp and onto the new, higher, drained grade where it has stood ever since. When you walk through the Chicago Loop today and the streets feel solid and dry under your feet, you are walking on ground that men jacked up into the daylight by hand and then buried under fresh fill to hold it there. But not every building was worth lifting. And this is where the second method comes in, and it is just as strange as the first. A small wooden house is not worth the trouble of jacking up 6 feet and building a new foundation under it. It is easier to simply move it somewhere else. And so Chicago, and towns all across 19th century America, did exactly that. They picked up entire houses, intact, with the furniture still inside, and they hauled them down the middle of the public street to a new lot, or to the edge of town, or out to the suburbs. Here is how that worked. And again, no engines. First, the jack screws came out, the same as before, to lift the house off its foundation a little way into the air. Then men slid heavy, greased timber beams under it, runners, like the runners on a sled, pointed at the ends, so they would not dig in. Then they laid a temporary track of planks and crosties along the road, almost exactly like a railroad track made of wood, and they set the house down on rollers, big wooden cylinders, resting on that track. Now the house could roll. But what pulls a house? A horse is strong, but no horse can drag a house straight off the line. You cannot just hitch a team to the front and pull. So they used a capstan. A capstan is a vertical drum, like the ones sailors use on ships to haul up an anchor, mounted on a post driven deep into the middle of the street and chained down hard against the strain. A long rope or chain ran from the house, around the capstan drum, and out to a horse. The horse was hitched to a long arm and simply walked in a circle, around and around, winding the rope onto the drum. Each circle the horse walked pulled the house forward a little. The capstan multiplied the horse's strength the same way the screw multiplied a man's, by trading distance for force. The horse walked a long way around the circle, and the house crept a short way down the street. As the rollers came out the back of the moving house, men carried them around to the front and laid them down again, over and over, an endless loop of timber under a moving home, so the house always had fresh rollers under it. As the track cleared behind, they picked it up and relayed it ahead. The house rolled on this way, foot by foot, day by day, with smoke still curling from its chimney and people sometimes still living inside, cooking dinner on a stove that was rolling slowly toward a new address. It was so common in Chicago that travelers wrote about it as ordinary traffic. One Scottish visitor, David Macrae, wrote that never a day passed during his stay in the city that he did not meet one or more houses shifting their quarters. One day, he wrote, he met 9. 9 houses on the move in one day, rolling through the streets of a major American city behind horses walking in circles. To the people of Chicago, it was nothing. Just another thing in the road. Sometimes whole rows of buildings went together, lifted onto rollers, and walked out to the outskirts in a block. Pedestrians stepped aside on the sidewalk as a house glided past them, curtains still in the windows, and barely looked up. That is the everyday version of moving the impossible. Now let me give you the grand version. The largest building move of the entire century, and it was not in Chicago at all. It was on the edge of the sea, in Brooklyn, and it was pulled not by horses but by steam locomotives. One quick note. I turned the full story of how America moved entire buildings before trucks into a book. Everything the records gave me, all the names and all the numbers. If you want it, the link is in the description. On the shore at Coney Island stood the Brighton Beach Hotel. It went up in 1878, a long, low, grand seaside resort, 3 stories tall, around 170 guest rooms, with broad verandas facing the Atlantic. It had its own railroad, bringing crowds out from the city for the summer. It was huge. The building stretched something like 460 feet long and 130 feet deep, and the ocean was eating the beach out from under it. Year by year, the sea took back the sand. Storm after storm, the waterline crept closer to the hotel's foundation. By 1888, the Atlantic was nearly at the doorstep, and another big storm could have brought the whole resort down into the surf. The owners faced a choice: lose the hotel to the sea, or move it. They decided to move it. Not a wooden cottage, a 460-foot grand hotel. The engineer in charge was a man named B.C. Miller, and his plan was breathtaking in its nerve. He would put the entire hotel on railroad tracks and pull it inland with locomotives. Here's what they did. They jacked the whole hotel up, the same patient jack screw work, hundreds of screws sharing the load. Under the raised building, they laid down a great many parallel railroad tracks, on the order of 24 sets of rails running side by side, and onto those rails they ran more than 100 railroad flat cars, around 112 of them spread out under the length of the building to carry its enormous weight. The hotel now rested on a fleet of rail cars. And then they brought up the locomotives. 6 steam engines, working in 2 teams of 3. The move began in early April of 1888. The locomotives took up the strain, the wheels began to turn, and the Brighton Beach Hotel, all 460 feet of it, started to roll away from the sea. They moved it slowly, deliberately, over a span of days, around 9 days in all, creeping the building back from the water, a little at a time. People came just to watch it happen, a grand hotel crawling across the ground behind a line of steam engines. When it was done, the hotel sat about 600 feet inland from where it had stood, safe from the surf. And here is the detail that puts it beside the Tremont. They moved that gigantic building so gently that, by the accounts of the day, not a single pane of glass was broken, and not one mirror in any of the rooms was cracked. A 400-foot hotel rolled 600 feet across the ground on 100 rail cars behind 6 locomotives, and the glass did not even rattle loose. The same impossible gentleness, the same refusal to let the thing they were moving come to harm. The hotel lived on at its new spot for another 3 decades. It was finally torn down in 1923. But the move bought it 30 more summers it would never have had, and it stands in the record as the greatest building move of the 19th century. When you put the 2 stories side by side, you can see the whole arc of it. In Chicago, no engines at all, just thousands of men and thousands of screws turning together to lift a city out of the mud. In Brooklyn, 30 years later, 6 locomotives breathing steam to drag a hotel away from the ocean. Between them lies the moment when raw human muscle began to hand the heaviest work over to the machine. But the idea was always the same. Nothing is too big to move. You only have to break the impossible weight into thousands of small, patient turns and find enough hands or enough horsepower to make every one of those turns at the same time. Now let me be honest about the cost, because there always is one, and the records are quieter about it than I would like. This was dangerous work. Men spent their days in trenches dug under standing buildings, in the wet and the dark, with hundreds of tons of brick balanced over their heads on iron screws. A miscounted turn, a screw set wrong, a beam that slipped, and the load could come down. Working under a raised house to shift the rollers meant putting your body in the gap, the same gap that would close in an instant if anything failed. A snapped chain on a capstan under full strain could whip back and kill. A house could slide off its rollers and crush a leg. There was no machine to blame and no machine to hide behind. It was muscle and timing and nerve, and when it went wrong on top of a person. We do not have clean records of how many were hurt or killed doing this, and I will not invent a number for you. But anyone who has stood under a heavy load held up by hand knows what was at stake every hour these men worked. They took that risk for daily wages, on jobs that nobody recorded their names for, so that a hotel could keep serving dinner and a city could finally drain its streets. And there was the slower cost too. The patience of it. 5 days for a city block. Weeks for the Tremont. 9 days for the Brighton Beach Hotel. Years for the whole project, building by building, through the 1850s and into the 1860s, while ordinary life carried on around the screws. This was not fast work, and it was not glamorous work. It was a man turning a bar a half turn, then waiting, then turning it again, 10,000 times, until a building had climbed 6 feet into the sky. So what do we have to show for it? In Chicago, the answer is the city itself. The whole central grade, the streets of the Loop, the solid, dry ground a modern Chicagoan never thinks about, all of it sits on the higher level those men created by hand. The sewers Ellis Chesbrough designed could finally run downhill, the standing water drained away, and the epidemics that had been killing the city eased. They did not just save some buildings. They lifted a city up out of the disease and the mud and set it on dry ground, and it has stayed there ever since. Some of the very buildings they raised stood for years afterward, until the Great Fire of 1871 took much of the old wooden city. But the ground remained. The ground they raised is still under Chicago today. In Brooklyn, the hotel itself is long gone, demolished a century ago, taken by time the way the sea once nearly took it. What remains there is the story, and the photographs, the astonishing images of a grand seaside hotel sitting on railroad cars, mid-journey, halfway between the sea it fled and the safe ground ahead. And in towns all across the country, the legacy is a whole trade that we have nearly forgotten. House moving was once an ordinary American craft. The skill of lifting a building on screws and rolling it down a road did not die with the horse and the capstan. It became an industry, and companies still move houses and even masonry buildings today on hydraulic dollies now, instead of timber rollers, but using the same fundamental idea those 19th century crews proved. Lift it level. Move it slow. Do not let it break. I keep coming back to the senator in the Tremont house, finishing his supper, climbing a few extra steps to bed, never knowing that beneath the floorboards, 500 men were lifting the entire hotel up out of the earth. He slept through one of the most extraordinary feats of human muscle and patience this country ever performed. And in a way, so have the rest of us. We drive over Chicago's dry streets, we look at old photographs of houses rolling down the road, and we forget that real men, with iron screws and greased timbers and horses walking in circles, picked up the impossible and carried it, gently, an inch at a time, to where it needed to be. They did not have the machines. They had wood and iron and animals and each other and a rhythm called out in the dark. Turn. Stop. Level. Turn. And the building rose. We do not know their names. But the ground they lifted is still holding a city up. And every time a house rolls down a road somewhere in America, slow and whole and unbroken, their work is still rolling with it. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out and upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.